The year was 1992 and the world seemed to be in a transition. On one hand, the Cold War had ended and technology was beginning to bring us closer to the rest of the world, and on the other, the rebellion of grunge music resonated strongly with a generation of young people who were struggling to have their own identity. This youth with a more cynical and less optimistic spirit felt much more affinity towards raw comic stories like Watchmen or Punisher. This made it very hard for classic superheroes to be taken seriously. In this era of conflicts and anti-heroes, a group of Detective Comics writers sought a way to keep Superman, the most classic hero of all, the eternal Boy Scout. Relevant again? However, the task proved more challenging than anticipated, as the company had different plans for the character involving a popular television series. So this team of writers was forced to quickly make a decision that would change the history of comics forever. Kill the greatest superhero of all. The death of Superman began to take shape through a twist of fate that caused a domino effect in the industry. One that would bring a great era of economic profits, followed by a dark era where even Marvel Comics had to declare bankruptcy. In this video, we'll discuss how a single decision led to a significant impact. As I'm going to tell you how the comic of Superman's death came about, we will analyze some important points of the story, its cultural impact, and how this comic transformed the world. My name is Gio the Geek Monitor, and grab your favorite snack. It's time for a groundbreaking video essay as we embark on a historic first for this channel. The death of Superman was taken very seriously. Chapter 1. Creating the Death of Superman. By the mid-80s, the continuity of Detective Comics had become too complicated for the average reader. Since by that time, the company already had almost 50 years of canonical stories involving hundreds of different universes. So it was difficult, even for the writers, to keep track of everything. To celebrate its 50th anniversary, Detective Comics rebooted its entire universe. But the idea was not simply to start from scratch, but to create a story that made sense of this change. Thus was born the Crisis on Infinite Earths, where worlds lived, worlds died, and the Detective Comics universe was never the same again. Heroes and villains from many universes had to join forces to defeat absolute evil. And at the end of the story, a new, much more reader-friendly 100 universe was formed, with stories that would start from scratch. One of them, obviously, would be the story of Superman. John Byrne, the Marvel veteran who wrote and drew Fantastic Four and X-Men, was tasked with shaping Superman's new mythology. And he did it with quite a success, as he managed to renew several of the classic elements of Superman and incorporate different themes, like a new Lex Luthor, who was now an evil businessman instead of just a scientist. A more functional relationship with Lois Lane. And above all, he established the Kents as central characters, who were now in charge of shaping and guiding their son Clark through this complicated world. Byrne's approach worked so well that at one point he was in charge of 3 different Superman titles a month. After his departure, Detective Comics struggled to find a suitable replacement. So they decided to hire a team of 4 writers for the now 4 Superman titles that were on the market. However, this team not only had to face a significant decline in the sales of the Man of Steel's comics, but also the fact that pop culture was changing. And now, anti-heroes like Punisher or more violent heroes like Wolverine seemed much more appealing than our Boy Scout with a red cape and underwear on the outside. This creative team came up with a great idea to attract an audience. However, things did not go as they expected. The fact is that the death of Superman was a story that was born as an accident. The original idea was to marry Superman, not kill him. But how did they go from wedding to funeral? In December 1990, Clark Kent, after over 50 years of stories, proposes to Lois Lane, who accepts unaware that he is Superman. Unfortunately, someone objected to the marriage, and it wasn't any comic book villain, but the then president of Detective Comics, Janet Kahn. This was due to the development of Lois Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, a series centered on the couple. So Warner wanted to align the date of the wedding in the comics with the wedding in the series. The series would take over 2 years to materialize, so the writers had to quickly come up with a solution. Something that was not going to be easy, as all the pieces were in place to carry out a wedding, a big event that would attract many readers. This was when Jerry Ordway said in the writer's room, a joke he used to repeat every time they found themselves in a creative block: "We're just going to kill them." However, on this occasion there were no laughs, because the 4 Superman writers suddenly realized that maybe it wasn't a bad idea. Pop culture and youth seem to have decided that Superman was no longer about the man of tomorrow, but represented a heroism that seemed increasingly obsolete and distant. Similarly, we had taken for granted that Superman would always be there to save us, no matter how much we ignored him. However, with Comic Superman number 75, the world would experience for the first time in over 50 years what life would be like without a Superman. The creative team already had their idea. Now it was time to decide who would be chosen to kill the greatest hero of all. It was decided that it had to be a new character and that previously used tactics such as kryptonite or even a master plan would not be used. The team opted for Dan Jurgens' idea of a monster versus Superman story, which he was developing for the comic. In Metropolis, it was a very simple idea, but they decided that having a destructive force capable of beating Superman to death could result in a novel concept. Another very important point is that they didn't want to give the character an origin because they wanted the whole story to revolve around the great fight between these two titans. The name? On his part, it was also an accident, as editor Mike Carlin wrote on the board the phrase the Doomsday, that is Superman's Judgment Day. Something that sounded quite attractive and ended up staying. Finally, the design can be attributed to Dan Jurgens, who created this monstrous creature with protruding bones, with the intention of emulating those popular edgy 90s designs, which I find to be a very interesting choice. Because it's as if, in a way, Superman is not only facing Doomsday but also the pop culture of that time, a battle that perhaps not even the Man of Steel would be able to win. Chapter 2: The Story of the Comic. Somewhere Doomsday is approaching. Relentless, unstoppable Doomsday is here. Doomsday was introduced at the end of Superman the Man of Steel, number 17 in November 1992. A small prelude to what would later be known as the arc of Superman's death. Despite the story's simplicity, it's important to note this. It does have some very specific objectives, particularly introducing us to the protagonists and their way of seeing the world. Initially, Doomsday was just a destructive monster without an origin story, who escaped captivity and started destroying everything in his way. Panels like this one suggested that he even enjoyed, in a basic way, the act of taking a life. He was a being that seemed to be full of hate and who, for some reason, opposed any form of life, someone who destroyed for pleasure. On the other hand, although the readers already knew Superman, the comic wanted to make clear why he was such a special character. That's why the arc begins with Superman rescuing a child for the second time and perfectly remembering his name, as if he were a dear friend. Later, Superman's interview with Cat Grant reveals, through his answers, why he is a cherished hero. All this while the Justice League of that time fights against the monster we now call Doomsday.
I appreciate you coming, Superman. It's very rare that you give interviews.
I believe that to earn the trust of Americans, they first have to get to know us. Miss Grant, without your trust, we are not as effective.
As the leader of the Justice League, could you share the untold story of you and your companions?
Allow me to correct you on that aspect, Miss Grant. It's not fair to the others to be considered the leader of the League. We are a group of individuals who come together to do the work that we can't do alone.
Vero, is there a projectile approaching?
Prepare for impact.
Don't be modest. Many say that your presence gives the League more strength.
It was already a talented and dedicated group before I joined. Miss Grant, it's an honor to be part of the League.
What do you prefer, burial or cremation?
Tell me, Superman, are you afraid of anything?
Good question, miss. Look, fear is always present in our work. I'm afraid of failing or hurting innocent people. And being honest, sometimes I fear for my life.
A special report interrupts the transmission. The Justice League is being massacred by an unknown monster. It's time for Superman to go to the rescue. At this point is when Superman finally joins what would be the last battle of his life. However, another character often goes unnoticed, but who is also very important to the story that is intended to be told, because it is the character that represents the audience of that time. The story follows Mitch, a young man watching Superman's interview at his high school. However, in his mind, Superman is just a dull and average Boy Scout. He says he would have preferred they interviewed someone like Guy Gardner, a character more similar to the popular anti-heroes of that era. Mitch eventually gets home, where he has a fight with his mother, but this is interrupted when the heroine named Ice flies in through the window. And his house becomes a war zone between the Justice League and Doomsday, who eventually incapacitates the entire League. Mitch and his family get caught in the crossfire when this happens. Initially, Superman makes the tough decision to ignore Mitch's plea for help in order to catch Doomsday before he causes more damage. But seeing that no member of the League can help the family, the Man of Steel manages to distract Doomsday and finally save them. So look what we have here, a person who represents the youth of that time, the one who prefers heroes, those who make tough decisions. And here we see how at first Superman does it, but then he regrets it and goes back to help the family. As the comic progresses, Mitch realizes how this classic heroism and this need to help everyone no matter what are still very relevant values. While it may seem paternalistic, it's important to remember that in this comic, Superman was not only battling Doomsday but also the culture at large. Over the next issues, Doomsday and Superman engaged in a fierce battle that felt increasingly intense. In fact, I'm going to give you an interesting fact about why it feels that way. Look at these pages from the Death of Superman comic and tell me if you notice a pattern throughout them. Did you notice anything? No? Let's move on to the next issue and focus on the panel count per page this time. Nope. So this comic then, in addition to telling a story, serves as a countdown to Superman's death. That's why this issue has 4 panels per page, the next one 3, then 2, and in the final battle against Doomsday, only 1 image per page. The idea was that this countdown would make the battle feel increasingly aggressive, brutal, and imposing. And something to remember is that comics have the ability to tell stories. Not only through images and dialogues, but also through physical elements, such as the layout of the panels. In the Batman story with the Court of Owls, there's a part where Batman is disoriented and lost in a maze. And you, as a reader, have to keep turning the comic to read it, which conveys that feeling of being lost, just as Superman's death gives you this sense of impending end. The intense fight between Doomsday and Superman leads them to Metropolis's center, just outside the Daily Planet. The monster seems about to finish off Superman, so Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane, who are reporting what happened, do their best to distract the monster, giving Superman valuable seconds to recover and continue fighting to protect his friends and the city he loves.
I'm exhausted, but I must keep fighting until one of us dies.
Their punches are so forceful that the shockwaves shatter the windows of the Daily Planet. But neither of them stops and both collide in a final and explosive effort. In the coming years, some people will recount the power of these final blows, others will remember the enormous crater that the fight left. But most will remember this sad day as the day of the noblest man ever known. Finally, he fell before the astonished eyes of his friends. An image that now seems suspended in time, captured by Jimmy Olsen's camera. And for those who were his parents, this would be the darkest day they could ever imagine. They taught him the importance of sacrifice and valuing life, only for it to end this way. For a city to remain safe, one man gave everything he could and more.
Please hold on.
The paramedics will arrive soon.
We are from.
You stopped him, you saved everyone. Now rest until...
But Luis doesn't know that it's too late because this is the day on which a Superman died. Chapter 3: Life After Death. This omnibus contains several annexes. In this special report from El Planeta newspaper, various Detective Comics characters share their feelings about Superman's absence following his passing. From Wonder Woman to Bruce Wayne and Lex Luthor. This major news was covered not only in Detective Comics fictional media, but also in real life. Comic readers were mostly used to big events where a character would die in their favorite comic, and then somehow came back. But this was something completely new for the mainstream audience and the media, who took the announcement of Superman's death as something absolute and irreversible. Newspapers, talk shows, and even news programs fully immersed themselves in this event. And the comic became a media phenomenon that made millions of people who had never bought a comic buy a copy of this story. Because everyone wanted to see firsthand if the Man of Steel had really died. This is observable even today. When I meet someone who doesn't like comics and they learn about my job, they often say something like this. I had Superman's death comic from Editorial B. It's something I always enjoy listening to, as it reminds me of a time when comics captured everyone's attention. These comics you see here are some of the first I ever bought, appealing to both geeks and normies. Because I knew I had to read the story of Superman's death at some point, even though many years had passed since the event. Finally, Superman number 75, the issue where the Man of Steel finally fell to Doomsday, sold 6 million copies, a number far greater than the 150,000 copies that Superman usually sold, which even doubled the price of Detective Comics' shares overnight. And this story arc became one of Detective Comics' biggest hits, but the writer's work was not over. It's true that the Man of Steel had fallen, but they still had to write what happens in a world without Superman, and also maintain the sales they had already achieved. The second part of this saga would be titled Funeral for a Friend, and it starts precisely with a team of scientists and paramedics trying to save the life of the Man of Steel. Meanwhile, those close to him like Lois Lane or the Kents clung to hope. The story focused on introducing us when the sad news was finally given. How did different characters within the world of Detective Comics deal with the death of their greatest hero? The superhero community unites to honor his memory through a funeral and by protecting his city. But I think my favorite part is seeing how some people without powers deal with this event. We see a man trying to profit from Superman's death. Not due to a lack of respect, but ultimately life continues and he must provide for his family. We also meet Vivo Webowski, the Man of Steel's biggest fan. He wonders in a moment of solitude, what kind of god allows such a man to die? While a veteran like him remains alive. So all he can say is, "It's not okay, God, it's not okay." But undoubtedly, my favorite part of the funeral has to do with the Kent family. When Superman died at the hands of Doomsday, the whole world united in mourning to bid farewell to their greatest hero. Many superheroes and politicians assembled in Metropolis, and the streets were crowded with thousands of people looking to say goodbye to the last son of Krypton. Unfortunately, this funeral was to say goodbye to the legend, not to the man he truly was. No one knew that Clark Kent was really Superman, so the people closest to him, like Lois and Jimmy, or even the Kents, they couldn't approach the coffin, so they had to watch the funeral from a television. In Kansas, Martha turns that off. We will say goodbye to our son in our own way and let the world say goodbye to Superman in its own way. Martha and Jonathan Kent then took some of Clark's personal belongings and buried them at the site where his rocket crashed to Earth. So many years ago,
You were our gift from heaven, and from the beginning we loved you with all our heart. Heaven left you with us, and now heaven has taken you.
so while the world's most powerful heroes were burying Superman, the Kents in private buried Clark Kent in their own way. A few copies later, the sorrow of losing a son was too much for Jonathan Kent, who suffered a heart attack and lost the will to live. "I'm coming, son." With that cliffhanger, the funeral section concludes. And believe it or not, Detective Comics stopped publishing all Superman titles for 3 months. This dramatic pause made the public think that maybe Superman was really gone, since a comic company had never been seen making a similar move before. However, after the pause, it was time to bring the Man of Steel back, something that the writers said was even more difficult than killing the character. The plan was for a new character to briefly replace Superman, not to bring him back right away. However, each of the 4 writers had a different idea of how to approach the problem. Roger Stern aimed to reimagine Eradicator as a version of Superman that was far more extraterrestrial than human in nature. Karl Kessel proposed a music television generation Superman concept. Dan Jurgens wanted his character Hank Henshaw to deceive the world into thinking he was Superman. And Louis Simonson wanted to revisit the old legend of John Henry, the man who stood up to machines to create a kind of people's Superman. Ultimately, it was decided that 4 different characters were appropriate since there were 4 Superman titles, which would make the public wonder if any of them was truly the real Man of Steel. This arc would be named The Reign of the Supermen, taking inspiration from the name of the first ever Superman story, where the character was even a villain. In this way, the path was started to bring Superman back to life. The Man of Steel then had not only defeated death itself, but also proved that he could still be relevant, over half a century after his creation. At the same time, he injected new life into companies like Detective Comics and even Marvel, who saw events like this as an opportunity to increase their sales. Unfortunately, the death of Superman also had negative consequences in the medium term for the industry. Why? Imagine a world where many people buy comics as an investment. Today it is much less common, but in the 90s, a type of comic buyer. Speculators started acquiring copies, believing they could fetch a high price in the future. This type of buyer was born because at the end of the 80s, comics like Watchmen or Killing Joke began to sell very well among adults, and very old comics began to be highly collectible. Speculators bought comics that seemed likely to become famous in the future, despite the uncertainty involved in predicting which ones would succeed. How did they decide this? Well, they basically consumed stories where there were drastic changes in a character. Major events or issues with significant numbering like 1, 50, 500, etc. Which made the comic of Superman's death a perfect hook for them. What was the problem with this? Detective Comics and others aimed to replicate the success of Superman's death by any means necessary. During this period, we witnessed events that significantly changed the characters. From Nightfall, where Bane breaks Batman's back, to the Spider-Man clone saga. There were many gimmick covers like holograms and embossing, but the worst was likely this cover. They made a hole in it, as if it were a bullet impact, but the problem is that the interior art did not consider this hole. So, in the end, you just had a comic with a weird hole. This era also saw many titles debut at number 1 with high sales, only to drop significantly in the following issue. Ultimately, speculators ceased purchasing comics when they realized their anticipated millions would not materialize. This caused a domino effect in an industry that was increasingly less concerned with good stories and more with big events. As a result, a major crisis ensued, leading Marvel Comics to declare bankruptcy. There's a concept from the comic Doomsday Clock that I really like, and it's that at one point, Dr. Manhattan says that the entire Detective Comics universe seems to form and change around Superman, and I think something similar happens in the real world. Action Comics number 1 introduced Superman and launched the golden age of superheroes, which saw the creation of many iconic characters. Decades later, Christopher Reeve's Superman showed the world that movies of superheroes had the potential to tell great and box office stories on the big screen. And many years later, Superman changed the comic landscape again through his death. This story becomes one of the most iconic of the character, so it has been adapted over and over again in series, cinema, and animation. In modern adaptations of Superman, the Man of Steel's death seems to be an unavoidable plot point. Not only because it tells us the story of a character who was able to defeat death itself, but because it shows us the price that Kal-El was willing to pay to keep the world that adopted him safe. A feat that showed the public of that time that the values and style of heroism that Superman represents are far from being obsolete. It was a great story that completely changed the world. He keeps seeing beyond the obvious.